Early wasn't outside very long. The sounds of a cheerful Saturday afternoon in the neighborhood were irritating. How could everyone be so cheerfully absorbed in their mundane little lives when his was so thoroughly shattered? Every happy shriek of childish laughter raked across his nerves like fingernails on a chalkboard. How dare they? He went back inside and stalked past Susan. She collapsed, still crying, across the sofa cushions during the short time he was outside. Early said nothing to her as he passed. The resentment sparked inside him on the patio threatened to consume him now. He was afraid if he and his wife spoke to each other, the anger would explode into rage, and he didn't want that. It would serve no purpose to lose control. When the clock said it was time for lunch, frustration and irritation still controlled his thoughts. He made his way out the back door and climbed into the SUV. He didn't tell Susan where he was going. In truth, he didn't know himself. He drove without purpose until he saw the billboard outside the big hotel. Thoughts of finding a decent cafe somewhere for a meal were discarded in favor of anesthetizing the pain. The dimly lit lounge, it was a piano bar later in the evening, just off the hotel lobby, was a place he would normally find repugnant. This afternoon, though, it was a refuge. He didn't even have to talk to anyone except for the waitress, who brought him a drink whenever he called for one. After a couple of times, simply lifting his empty glass to catch her eye was enough. He had no need to communicate anything beyond the need for more alcohol. He took comfort from his anonymity in the dimly lit room. After all, he had no expectations of anyone here that could be crushed. There was no one here who could break his heart. He was safe here. It was late when he returned home. The sun had been down for hours, and the street lights were shining indistinctly through the living room windows. Early had taken on board sufficient alcohol for a good buzz and stayed there for a while. Instead of leaving the lounge when he tired of the sensation, he hung on long enough to down a quantity of undiluted cokes until he felt sober again. He had no desire to wreck anyone else's life by having an auto accident. His and Susan's lives were more than enough devastation to deal with. The 2 hamburgers consumed on the way home were in lieu of lunch and dinner both. The grease, both real and imagined, lay heavy on his stomach. The onions he'd forgotten to have removed were already threatening to come back up. Somehow, it fit the pattern of the rest of the day for him to feel physically ill now. I was worried, Susan said tearfully. The straight-back chair she sat on was hidden in a dark, out-of-the-way corner of the living room. Early hadn't seen her when he came in the door, but glanced her way now. He was in a mood to pass her by, but the habits of a lifetime stopped him. He was something of a headhunter in his professional life, but a man considerate of others in his private one. Early couldn't ignore his wife, but he couldn't conceal his feelings from her either. Your worry is too little, and about a week too late, Early said huskily. He told himself it was the raw alcohol he'd downed that day that coarsened his voice. He watched Susan wilt, sagging back against the chair back. "Oh God, Early," she whispered. "I just can't make you see how small a thing this is. It just didn't have anything to do with you and me. It wasn't important. It just didn't mean anything to us, Early. It's not a part of us. It was something I owed John. Please, baby, I still love you. And you love me, right? Isn't there anything at all that I can do to make things better?" Early's belly tightened spasmodically. He nearly lost the onions, along with everything else he'd eaten with them. He didn't try to speak for a long moment while he fought for control. Walking another couple of paces, he stopped at the bottom of the staircase and put a hand on the railing for support. "Something you owed him? Something you had to do to repay him?" Early muttered. His wife could barely understand his words. Before she could decipher what he was saying and find an answer, Early pressed on. "You keep saying that, Susan, and I have to admit, I just don't understand it at all," Early commented. Susan dabbed at the corners of her eyes with a tissue. She tried again to explain. "I just felt I had to do it," she said softly. "He deserves something for all the hard work he did for me on the Melrose account, and why not a marble, golden-laid desk set?" Early interjected, interrupting his wife for nearly the first time in their marriage. His voice was a little stronger than it had been, but it was still gruff and low-pitched. "What?" Susan asked, momentarily confused. "Oh." Her own voice failed. She had no idea how to answer her husband's question. "I don't know why that wouldn't have been just the thing, Susan. Nothing says thank you to someone you work with like a fancy, expensive desk set, right? Early asked in a facetious tone. He didn't wait for an explanation from his wife. Or how about the finest set of titanium golf clubs in the world? Early continued. Why couldn't you buy him a new Mercedes instead, Susan? Would you please tell me exactly why you had to repay Mr. Big John Stickner by fucking him? Susan flinched at the crude ending to Early's question. Early never resorted to foul language. While she fumbled for something to say, her husband sat down on the second step and leaned against the wall. He could barely see across the room to where his wife sat through the banister railing. He didn't mind. He didn't really want to see her. I can't explain it, Early, Susan said softly. I know it sounds crazy, but it seemed like I had to give him a small piece of myself to show how much I valued everything he'd done for me. She thought for a moment. He'd worked so hard, Early, and none of it was part of his normal job. He did it for me. I needed to repay him in a way that showed him I understood how personal a thing his support for me was. You know? What he did for me, for us, Early, is going to be the difference between staying where I was and getting that partnership, she moaned. Early laughed harshly. The cruel amusement shocked Susan into silence. She stared, wide-eyed, at her husband. There had been a trace of derision in the laughter, and that was so very out of character for her husband. Hell, Susan, Early choked out. Couldn't you buy him a Rolex with a nice inscription on the back? That's kind of personal, don't you think? Not as personal as underwear perhaps, but still personal, right? No, not personal enough, huh? He shook his head, seeming to pity his wife as she sat immobile and silent. Nah, you couldn't do any of those things, could you? You had to cheat, lie, deceive, and betray our marriage in order to find something worthy enough to give old John for helping you with the account. I sure hope he values your gift, Susan. I used to think it was pretty special myself, Early told her. Before she could protest, Early slapped his hands together briskly. The sharp sound cut off whatever she had been about to say. So, what are you going to give him the next time he does a favor for you, huh? He asked Susan. She stared at Early as one would a viper about to strike. A stricken expression spread over her features. She'd thought this idea had already been corrected this morning. Early, honey, I already told you there won't be a next time, she assured him in a low, earnest voice. He knows that, she added. He knows this was an expression of my admiration and respect, and that it could never be repeated, she finished. Early snorted loudly. Bull crab, he said succinctly. He's got your number now, babe, he told her. All he has to do is be nice and do just a tiny, little bit more than just his regular job, and you're going to reward him with a few nights in the sack every now and then, Early said. Hey, Early remarked as a thought occurred to him. A couple more accounts, a few more negotiations he helps you with, hell. You could be in charge of that whole place in a few years, couldn't you? Darn, now I call that upward mobility with a capital M. Susan's face must have blanched in the darkness, but Early couldn't see. He didn't really care anymore if she turned pale or reddened with embarrassment. Early, Susan said quickly. This isn't right. You keep thinking of this like it was a tawdry rendezvous in a cheap motel or something, and that's not what it was, she insisted. The hell it wasn't, Early shot back. I asked you this morning if it was something beautiful for you, and you didn't answer. You want to clear that up before we go on? He asked Susan. She stared at her husband. Her lips were pinched into a stubborn line. Yeah. That's kind of what I thought, Early remarked in a tired voice. He let the silence build. I just can't get this out of my head, Susan, he said finally. You don't even want me to call what you did tawdry, but tawdry is really a very nice way of putting what I actually think about what you did. Want to know how I really feel about it? Early asked his silent wife. He peeked between the banister posts, but could see little of his wife's expression. He shrugged. And the announcer reminds us to supply the answer in the form of a question, Early said glibly. Okay, Susan, what do you call a 2-day chew and duck, he demanded. The words echoed in the dim room and then died a slow death in a far corner. Neither of them broke the silence for a while. I never thought I'd ever hear you speak of me that way, Susan said faintly. She began crying softly again. Early snickered, letting it through his wife's tears. I never thought you would do me that way, dear wife. But I understand where you're coming from. It's kind of disconcerting, you might say, for me too, when someone who insists she loves me turns hateful and nasty, he drawled. You can imagine what I was feeling, sitting there in our bedroom while you lied in your teeth about how lonely you were going to be that night. Darling, Early continued sarcastically. Susan flushed. Early was surprised he could see her face darkening. He looked around, taken aback for a moment. It was only a passing car. The headlights momentarily lit the room through curtains not quite completely drawn. The fast-moving vehicle moved down the street, and the living room returned to dimness. Early, I can't tell you how sorry I am about this, honey, Susan said in a despairing voice, finally breaking the hush the intrusion had created. I didn't set out to hurt you. I wouldn't have done it if I thought it would. Early's chuckle was too close to hysteria in his ears. He ruthlessly throttled back his emotions so they wouldn't overwhelm him. He sat silently, fighting for control. Susan tried again. Honey, can't you see there was nothing about this that had anything to do with you? It was just about John and how great he was. She stopped again, realizing what she'd said had come out even more askew than what she'd said before. Oh, God, I didn't mean that. It wasn't like it sounded. Early. Please believe me. Susan's voice faltered and ended with a whisper. The force with which Early was shaking his head caught her attention even in the dimness. Her explanations had inflamed rather than soothed. Provoked, Early attacked. Hey, Susan, what do the file clerks get from you when they do an especially good job for you? Early asked harshly. Do you give all the paralegals a blowjob for the research they do for you? My goodness, Susan. How do you schedule all these thank yous for a job well done every week, honey? Early continued. Susan's sharp gasp told him how his words hurt. Early was beginning to understand. He hadn't actually drunk himself sober in the later afternoon, as he'd supposed. He told himself he'd regret tomorrow having badgered his wife so viciously tonight, but for now he really didn't care. But he could stop now. Her pain was enough. If nothing else, he owed it to the woman she had been to stop the vindictive accusations. He stood, balancing carefully as he rose. Though he'd done nothing particularly physical today, he was exhausted. Early, Susan said hurriedly. You still love me. You told me so this morning. We're going to work this out, right? She pleaded. That's what I told you, yes, Early acknowledged. But I hadn't thought things all the way through, he added. I thought I had, but I hadn't. He paused to organize his words. Yeah, I do love you, but I don't know if it'll be enough, Susan. I just don't know how I can get by this thing you did to us, Early murmured softly. It took me some time to figure everything out, he said to his sobbing wife. I quit drinking booze back in that bar, and I just drank Cokes for the longest time. You know? It's a curious thing, but waiting in a bar to sober up, it gives a man a lot of time to just sit and think. Strange, huh? Early was quiet for a time. He didn't know how to express the emotions that had come to him in the sheltering darkness of the hotel bar. His wife's tears didn't affect him as they had in the years they'd been married, though. He was quietly surprised at how detached he was beginning to feel. What's come to bother me most of all is how you planned this out so very carefully, Early said slowly. In the law, what do you all call that? It's darn it, what's it called? Oh, got it. Premeditation. Yeah, that's it, premeditation, Early told her. You waited until you found out I had to go on a business trip, and then you set everything up very carefully, didn't you? In fact, you couldn't have done it without a lot of that premeditation and planning stuff. Could you? He asked Susan. She couldn't answer. Her head hung low. She would give anything to counter her husband's argument, but nothing came to her. She didn't agree with his reasoning, but she was beginning to despair of ever convincing him of how she had felt about this whole thing. You had to let Jennifer off for a nice long weekend, didn't you? Early continued. I guess you didn't want to ask her to lie for you, huh? No sense in letting her know about what you were going to do, right? Jennifer's a stand-up kind of lady. Hell, she probably wouldn't respect you a damn bit if she knew you were sleeping around, would she? She'd know right up front there was something wrong if I called, and I didn't have a clue about you taking a little holiday, wouldn't she? Early asked. After all, you'll be working with Jennifer for a long time to come, won't you? He climbed another step up the staircase. Jennifer must be one hell of a secretary, Early muttered. You respected her so very much and disrespected me at the same time, he added. On the other hand, it sure didn't bother you using that temp secretary to cover for you, did it? You could use her like the tool she was, couldn't you? You could afford to ignore her feelings about cheating, lying, and such, right? Early asked his wife. Susan didn't respond. Her face was in her hands and her shoulders shook as she cried. Well, if you haven't heard, she did her job real well, Early commented. She lied for you every time I called, and did it pretty well too, he added. He began to climb the staircase again, stopping only when a new question occurred to him. Darn, honey, he called down to his wife. Didn't you understand that temporary secretary is going to put things together someday? The firm isn't going to use her just this one time. She'll be back as someone else's temp someday. All she has to do is have lunch with the other secretaries and compare notes when she comes back. And when she does, this little repayment for good old John is going to be common knowledge all over the firm, right? So, how are you going to keep her quiet, Susan? What are you going to do for that temp? Huh? Or do you swing both ways? He asked maliciously. He told himself it was the booze talking again. He almost believed it. He warned himself he'd decided not to attack his wife on this level. He wanted to stay on a higher plane, but the pain wouldn't let up. It kept stabbing deep inside him whenever his attention drifted from the iron control he was striving for. Oh, God, Susan sobbed. Early, please. I'll do anything to get us past this, she whispered. She was no longer concerned with the obscene language her husband was using. Early noted Susan didn't reply to his questions. It was no surprise. He knew his wife well. He should. They'd lived as a married couple for a long time and had been together even longer. She had to ignore his suggestion the whole office would soon be aware of the tryst. He was certain she hadn't considered such a thing, and the prospect of everyone knowing was too devastating for her to think about. It was sad, he mused. Adulterers plan only for the best-case scenario. They ignore the possibility things might fall apart on them, and they don't bother setting up contingency plans. He felt a twinge of sorrow for what his wife would soon be facing in her own office. It passed quickly, though. She'd brought this upon herself. I'm sure you would like to get past this, Susan, Early replied wearily. It's no fun getting busted doing something you'd rather keep hidden deep in the shadows, is it? You'd love to get by this and forget all about it, wouldn't you? Susan didn't answer. Like what? Early continued abruptly, returning to his wife's offer. What would you do to get us past this? That would be like redemption, right? Like in the church? Cool. Pray tell, dear wife. What will you do to make things right between us, honey? How are you going to make me feel better about this? Verily, dear wife, how shall you redeem yourself in this marriage? His question caught Susan by surprise. She'd blurted out a suggestion she'd do something to make amends, but it had only been a hurriedly constructed and thoroughly theoretical idea. She hadn't contemplated specifics and had subconsciously assumed whatever she'd have to do would be comfortably far off in the future. In truth, a part of her thought the need to do something might never actually come about if she could just get past this moment. Time blurs all sorts of things, memories, pain, promises. It took her a moment to come up with a proposal. It wasn't one she liked. I could quit my job, Susan suggested tentatively. I'll find a job somewhere else, she continued unhappily. Her voice betrayed how much the offer hurt her. She was very proud of the things she'd accomplished at the law firm. She recalled regretfully how well she'd been doing. There wouldn't be any partnerships coming her way now, though. You would? Early asked, coming back down a step. Yes, Susan said, biting off the word as if speaking it caused her physical pain. Why would you bother doing that? Early asked with mock wonder in his voice. What? Susan said in shocked reply. She didn't know if her husband was rejecting her solution or not. It didn't sound good, though. Why bother? Early repeated, one word at a time. There'd be a John Stickner there, too, and you'd find a need to repay him someday, he said in a dead tone. I would not, Susan retorted indignantly. Early, this was a huge mistake, honey, she said firmly. I know that now, and I'll never make it again, darling, she added sincerely. Early didn't respond while he considered what his wife had said. No, dear. I think you would, Early replied at length. And even if you didn't, Susan, I could never be quite certain, could I? He asked. The misery in his voice was clear. He climbed back up the step he'd just come down and stepped up another before pausing again. You've taken something that was incredibly beautiful, Susan, he said slowly, and you smashed it so completely I don't think it can ever be put back together again. We might glue all the pieces back together, but the cracks where it shattered would always be there, and we'd both know it. He let a small silence build. "Damn it, Susan," he said with a universe of agony in his tone. "You planned this. It isn't something like you letting passion get the better of you one night. It wasn't a mistake. You knew exactly what you were doing every step of the way. You deliberately decided to take a little vacation from our marriage, and you worked hard to make it happen. You manipulated me, Jennifer, your boss, to get the time off, that poor temporary secretary, all of us, just to get what you wanted, Susan. Why did you do all that, damn it? I'm tired of these nonsense reasons. You can tell yourself forever you were paying that asshole back for being a really good guy, but I'm not buying it, Susan, so you can quit trying. Susan, we've been married a while now. We've gotten to the point where we can guess what the other will say or do before we do it. So, wife, I know just as surely as if I had been there reading your mind whatever day it came to you. You got the idea one day you'd like to try Mr. John Stickner on for size, didn't you? Maybe a naughty thought flicked through your mind one afternoon when he bent close and you caught a whiff of his cologne, maybe? Or perhaps you saw how powerful a man he was in the firm, how influential he is around town. Was that it? How'd it start, Susan? Did he touch your arm once and you not pull away? The next time he stroked your forearm gently and you let him, didn't you? Is that the way it started, Susan? Susan couldn't answer accusation. She sobbed quietly in the dimness. Whatever, I guess it really doesn't matter, does it? Early said, more or less indifferently. Fact is, you built your little daydream a little bit at a time, didn't you? No one else knew about your fantasy. Not at first anyway. You told yourself those secret little dreams wouldn't hurt anything or anyone. And pretty soon you believed it, didn't you? No harm, no foul, right? It was just a naughty little fantasy about him and you about soft summer days and hot, sweaty nights. How romantic can you get, right? Early snorted derisively. Then, one day, a notion came to you. Viola. Heck, it was easy when you thought about it. You wonder why it took so long to come to you. All you had to do was wait until I was out of the picture for a day or two. You know how my job works. You knew I'd have to go out of town sooner or later. Didn't you? Then I wouldn't be in the way. Then I couldn't stop you from something that was meant to be, right? Was that the way it went, darling? Susan moaned quietly. Yeah, it was, or something awfully similar, huh? Early remarked gloomily. He was suddenly tired of the farce. Anyway, the idea of having a little fling got to you, and you waited for the opportunity while you rationalized to yourself why you were doing it. You know, there's something I wonder about, Susan. It's simply this. How many excuses went through your head until you found one that fit what you wanted to do? I had to repay him. That's what you're telling me, right? What kind of crap is that, Susan? Early asked plaintively. Cries Susan, no one smart enough to be an attorney in this town, much less one as good as you are, could actually buy that line, but you wanted to believe it so you could feel better about yourself, I guess. Early checked his words for a moment. He was breathing hard and fast. His feelings of betrayal and anger at his wife's deceit were getting the best of him again. Damn it, Susan. Did you even wait until my plane was even off the ground before you packed your overnight bag, Susan? No. Yes? Which was it, Susan? His wife could only shake her head as she cried. Oh, I see. Heck, you didn't actually take that much clothing, did you? It wouldn't have taken long. It would have been quick to throw a few skimpy things in a bag and go, right? You could have left off packing right to the last minute. Couldn't you? What else? Oh, you probably set up Jennifer's time off earlier in the week, didn't you? You arranged for a temp at the same time, prompted her on what to say if I called, and then you flopped on your back, spread your legs, and let John Stickner have at it. Early finished. Susan cried harder. There was no way she could refute what her husband was saying. It wasn't accurate. It wasn't right, and it hadn't been the way she was feeling at the time, but there was nothing she could say to make things better. Early slowly climbed a few more steps up the long flight of stairs. What I said this morning, Susan, he called down. He couldn't see his wife. He didn't want to see her right now. There was a muffled response he took as an acknowledgement from her. Well, I think I was wrong, Early told her dejectedly. Susan's heart seemed to stop beating in her breast. She held her breath, dreading what she was suddenly certain she was about to hear. I thought about it all the while I was here waiting for you the past 2 nights, and couldn't get much of anywhere. I thought I had things straight in my mind, but I guess a little drinking loosened up my thinking, you know, Early said unhappily. He paused. Like I said, I got to thinking about what a callous little plan it was that you set up, Susan. I thought it all the way through, and I realized I didn't know much about you, wife. And what I did know, I didn't like. I had no idea you could do such a thing to me. None at all. It floored me, Susan. I just can't get past the cold-blooded manipulation, Susan. When I looked at everything you did and began to understand how it went down, how you did all that preparation and scheduling and arranging things, my God, Susan. Early's voice broke, and he paused for a long moment. I just don't know where the outright contempt you must have for me to do this thing. And then all the deliberate, calculated lying, the deceit. Well, I'm sorry, but it's done something to me, Susan. I suppose I still love you. I probably do. I guess maybe. Heck, I'm not even sure I know what love is anymore, Susan, but I know what you've been doing behind my back, isn't it? Early stood silent on the stairs and listened to his wife cry in the darkness. It affected him less than he'd thought it would. He roused himself. Anyway, he continued, I won't use love as an excuse to forget the total lack of respect. Is that the word? I don't know, heck, it'll do. What I won't do is use love as an excuse to tolerate, to get over your complete lack of respect for me and for our marriage, Susan. He climbed 4 more steps, lifting each foot deliberately and carefully. He stopped only 1 step from the landing. Susan, he said in a more formal tone than he'd ever used before with his wife. I have to take back what I said this morning. I don't think this is going to work out. I don't think there's any way on earth I will feel good about you ever again. Actually, right this minute, I don't think all the years we have left on earth will put us right again, Susan. His voice turned raspy and gruff. And, honey, I'm sorry, but I'm not willing to try either, Early told his wife. He heard Susan's crying gain strength as he took the last step. He weighed what was in his mind. This next part didn't have to be said just now. In the morning, things might feel different, maybe? No, actually they wouldn't. Susan, he said slowly and carefully. It was the only way he could maintain control. Susan, he continued, I think it would be a good idea for you to move out tomorrow, or as soon as you can. There was no sound save for Susan's hopeless sobbing. It went on for a long time without either of the couple attempting to end it. Early couldn't see his wife, nor she him. There was no need to see each other to feel the pain. I'm so very sorry, Susan, Early whispered softly, his words drifting down the long stairwell to his wife. He stepped across the landing to the room where he'd moved his personal things. Love isn't going to be enough this time, Susan. It would eat at me until I had nothing left of myself. I can't do it. The cost would just be too much. He closed the door and locked it behind him.